Hi, everyone. This is Chris Lehmann, editor of The New Republic. I'm welcoming you to the launch of the new documentary, Capital in the 21st Century, based on Thomas Piketty's best-selling book of the same name. Our partners at Kino Lorber have just released the film in a virtual cinema format in the face of our forced social isolation as part of a new initiative called Kino Marquee, which directly supports independent theaters that have been forced to temporarily close due to COVID-19. So if you haven't already, you can find your local theater to support while you watch the film at Kino Marquee, K-I-N-O Marquee, as you would expect, .com/capital. Spoiler alert for the film, Capital wins. I also should, in the spirit of capitalism, plug my own organization, The New Republic, which is the oldest liberal journal of opinion in America. And we also have excellent internet-based products for you to register for and enjoy. If you go to newrepublic.com, no "the" in front, you can sign up for our daily newsletter, which is sort of the central clearinghouse for all the work we do in print and online. I also want to urge you to check out the June issue of the magazine, which is just now about to come back from the printers and explores the challenge of remaking the economy in the wake of the COVID crisis and addressing specifically the kind of issues of deep-seated structural inequality we're going to be discussing today. There's also a review of Thomas Piketty's new book, Capital and Ideology, in that issue, which is quite good. Okay, that's the basic MC housekeeping here. Let me proceed to introduce our panelists. We have Ian Bremmer, Global Political Risk Advisor and President and founder of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. We also have Gillian Tett, who is chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large US of the Financial Times, and co-founder of Moral Money, which is also a web newsletter devoted largely to questions of green capitalism. And Thomas Piketty, the man behind the documentary we're discussing, the author of Capital in the 21st Century and Capital and Ideology. Thomas is professor at EHESS and the Paris School of Economics. So I wanted to kick off today's discussion by discussing the elephant in the room and across the world, which is the reason we're having this discussion in this format and people are seeing the movie virtually, the COVID crisis. It's also the reason why none of us have haircuts. You know, Capital, the book, and as well as the documentary, makes the case that the sort of tectonic events that occasion a more equitable distribution of capital tend to be crises and wars. The First and Second World Wars, most notably, and the Great Depression, less so, I guess, the 2008 meltdown. But the question I wanted to put to you, Thomas, at the outset is, what kind of structural readjustments can we anticipate in the wake of this present crisis? We're now in a position in the United States and elsewhere where the political and financial elites are openly discussing an acceptable trade-off between what level of mass death is tolerable for our citizenry in exchange for reopening the economy. That, to me, is a very eloquent statement of the society we now live in. And I just wanted to get your impression as, you know, someone who's studied this subject so intently in so many other settings of crises and disasters, how you see the global economy reshaping and recovering from this crisis.
Yeah, first, you know, let me let me say, let me thank everybody who made this event possible. Let me say also that I did not become a film director. So the real man behind the movie is Justin Pemberton from New Zealand, who made this movie and who expressed himself with, pictures and sounds in a way that, I'm not able to, I use words, I use language of social sciences. And I think both forms of language are complementary, but, he's really the one behind the movie much more than me. Now, coming to the current context, you said in history, crises and wars, can lead to movement sometimes toward equality. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they also lead to political monsters. They lead to all sorts of bifurcation and trajectories. And in my new book, Capital and Ideology, which I should apologize, it's again a very long book, but I should say it's very readable. It can be read by anyone. And this is a time when we have time, so watch movies, read books, and one general lesson from this book is that the kind of crisis like the one we have today, in the end, it's more what kind of political mobilization and social mobilization will get us into a different set of trajectories, because in itself, certainly this crisis is going to increase the legitimacy of a certain kind of state intervention and public investment in hospitals. I guess in most countries, people will believe after the crisis that it's, more legitimate to put resources in public health system and hospitals than they believed before the crisis, or at least we can hope that this can have this kind of impact. But over and beyond this, this crisis could lead to very different political and ideological evolution. And in history, pandemics often lead to a further closing of frontiers and mistrust of foreigners. And right. I can see already the people, the political actors, certainly in your country, in the US, yes. But I can also see, in my country, in France, how certain political actors, there will be regional elections in France next year, and, the extreme right could do very well. And it's so at this stage, I think we have to be very serious about what we're going to learn from this crisis and how we're going to change the course of globalization. Because if we don't take that seriously, and after the 2008 financial crisis, we printed a lot of money in order to save the financial sector, and so we avoided the complete bankruptcy of the banking sector that we had in the 30s, which is better than nothing. But apart from that, we very much went back to business as usual very fast, and we did not really change the rules of globalization. And I think this crisis is showing us really the need to change the economic system. It's also illustrating the extreme scale and violence of inequality. So, you have people who are locked down in a very nice apartment. You have people who are locked down in a very small home. Many people who are homeless, and this raises question about public requisition of housing and rent freeze and exactly the kind of desacralization of private property, which over time, in the 20th century, has allowed us to build a bit more equitable societies. And I think this long-run reduction of inequality has been very successful historically. So, you said in your introduction, capital wins at the end. Well, capital does not always win. Okay. In the long run, there is actually a reduction of inequality, in particular through the expansion of public education, public health, progressive taxation, more workers' rights. And in the long run, this has been a very successful process. And this has come with more prosperity, more productivity. And, I think we should continue in this direction. But we have to be serious about the recovery and the way we want to change our economic system based on this crisis and this experience we've had since 2008 and now with this new crisis of a very different nature. Now, in the very short run, of course, the only priority is to avoid that human casualties get to the enormous level. It's important that we all have in mind that, according to epidemiological model, this could lead to, 40, 50 million people dying all over the world if there is no action taken, with no lockdown, and with huge social inequalities within countries and between countries about who's affected. And so that's really today's the key priority, and we can also talk about the next world and the next economic system, and we have to do both, but I think we have to keep the two,
well, one
priorities.
sort of follow-up question I wanted to ask is the film also tells a story of the deconcentration of capital in the 18th and 19th century under the pressure of social revolution, and that part of the story, I think, is a very difficult one, in a time of declining labor movements, activism, and membership in the United States in particular. And, part of the problem in creating this other world that I think we all want, of diminished inequality and broad middle class prosperity and social mobility, is politics. And right now, our political sphere is, like everything else, is shut down. So I'm wondering if you can envision, what kinds of pressures from outside capital can be exerted to render it more democratic in the way that it has been historically.
Right. I want to, in the end, I want to send an optimistic message, in the sense that, of course, okay, we don't have the labor movement we had in the 20th century, but we have other forms of political mobilization and collective mobilization which are happening, and things are changing pretty fast. If I look at the recent electoral campaign for the Democratic primary in the US, so of course Sanders and Warren didn't win and Biden won, but at the same time, what you could see is that proposition, like creating a federal wealth tax in the US, became very popular, in the electorate. So if you look at opinion polls, both in the Democratic electorate and in the Republican electorate, you see a lot of support for the billionaire tax idea. And this is the first time ever, this is proposed at a full scale in a US political campaign, and you get this kind of support in opinion rating. I remember 6 years ago, at the time my previous book came out, I had some public meeting with Elizabeth Warren in Boston discussing the wealth tax, and at the time, she was very cautious, and nobody was advocating that. And 4 years later, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren have been sort of competing to propose a bigger wealth tax, and it's not only in the US, like in Germany, which is another important country in the global economic debate, and which very often has been sort of very conservative in terms of economic thinking over the past 10 to 15 years. 6 years ago, when I was going to Berlin and discussing with SPD leadership, so Social Democratic Party leadership, and the finance minister at the time, Sigmar Gabriel, didn't want to hear about the possible reintroduction of a wealth tax. 3 months ago, I was in Berlin, and the new SPD leadership is competing with Die Linke and with the Green to see who is going to propose the biggest wealth tax. And right now, because of the pandemic, there's a parliamentary discussion in Germany to do something that was already used in Germany and also in Japan after World War II, which was to have an exceptional wealth tax on very high levels of wealth. At the time, it was used to share the burden of many people who were going back to Germany from Eastern territories, and also to reduce the enormous public debt coming from the war. And so what Japan and Germany did, which was very successful, was to have a very progressive tax on higher wealth individuals, with very low tax rate on middle class and lower wealth individuals, but on very high wealth levels, going up to 50% on the stock of high wealth in Germany, up to 80-90% in Japan. And retrospectively, it allowed these countries to get rid of their public debt very fast and to invest in public infrastructure, education, and in post-war growth. And so I'm not saying, exactly the same is going to happen today, but you can see the debate about this in both in the US, in Germany, and in other countries, that over the past 4 to 5 years, has been changing very fast. And so, instead of seeing, the limitation of this evolution, I want to stress, the potential for more evolution of this kind. And everything I see in history, and particularly in my latest book, Capital and Ideology, and that this kind of ideological change can happen always, much faster and be much more powerful than what many current, commentators and in particular
it's worth,
group, tend to imagine.
Yeah, it's worth recalling, for instance, that in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt did not run on the platform of the New Deal. He was, basically forced by emergency circumstances of the sort we're now living through to adopt it as a means of both reviving and equalizing the economy. I wanted to bring in Gillian and Ian at this point too, to sort of get their impressions of this kind of fraught social moment, and how let's start with you, Gillian. How do you see the sort of issues that you've been working on over a longer compass, such as green investment, being affected by the present crisis?
Well, I thought that Thomas put a very good point on the table when he said that actually, if you look at what people like Elizabeth Warren have had as an agenda in the last few years, that was regarded as extreme and out there and almost unimaginable in the US context until very recently. But one of the very bitter ironies about the current American political situation is that although Bernie Sanders is no longer in the race, many of his ideas are essentially seeing a resurgence. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that I trained as an anthropologist before I became a journalist. I was very much raised in the whole sort of thought of Pierre Bourdieu, the great French thinker, and things like that. And we're all basically creatures of our own environment. We all assume that the way we think is natural and inevitable and will never change. And it's not until you go and try and do the anthropological exercise of getting out of yourself and understanding a completely different culture or time in history, and then use that perspective to look back at yourself, you realize that actually nothing is inevitable in terms of how we live. Conditions do change, thought processes do change, zeitgeist changes. And as Thomas said, often changes don't appear to be happening for a long time and then suddenly shift. Yeah. It happened in 2008, where we actually had considered it almost impossible when the crisis started that you'd see some kind of, big bailout of the sector. And then suddenly it seemed inevitable. If you look at what's happening with the debate now, not just around single-payer healthcare, but things like the state getting involved in, say, the Defense Production Act and suddenly mobilizing assets, and the state getting involved in sensitive areas of technology and development, you're beginning to see this very rapid zeitgeist shift. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to go towards the kind of society or policies that Thomas wants to see. We may end up with a form of state-controlled, nationalism, which would be very different from what many people who are watching would want to advocate for. But zeitgeist shifts can happen dramatically. And the last point I'd make is that one of the reasons they can often be so violent is that it's not just about economic capital, to go back to Bourdieu, it's also about social and cultural capital. And the elites tend to always try and control these, and they don't give them up lightly. But we're living through the middle of a big battle around that right now.
And Ian, Gillian raised the specter of a resurgent kind of state nationalism, and that's very much in your own wheelhouse. You're quoted in the film discussing China as one sort of vector of what capitalism may evolve into next. And I'm wondering, again, in the context of the present crisis, how you see that forecast playing out.
Well, first of all, again, delighted to be with all of you and participating, because Thomas has been so prescient globally in getting this issue out there when the political leaders were unwilling to. I basically see three things happening at the same time, and the question is, which is happening fastest. On the one hand, I agree completely with Thomas and Gillian that we are seeing a number of ideas move towards acceptance in the broader political spectrum much more quickly than you would have expected. The Spain and universal basic income, Nancy Pelosi saying just a week ago she'd be willing to accept something like that. The broader green initiatives across Europe as part of stimulus and what that's going to mean. And the willingness of Biden to accept big pieces, or at least compromise in big pieces of his own platform with Bernie Sanders to ensure that he gets that support. But there are two other things that are happening at the same time. One is that inequality is growing, and it's growing a lot, and it's going to grow a lot on the back of this crisis. The people that are suffering the most under this lockdown, both in terms of the jobs they're losing and also in terms of the health they're being exposed to, the health risk, are the people that are most disadvantaged, both from a class perspective, from a race perspective here in the United States, very obviously, from a gender perspective. I mean, all of those things are happening. And our ability to dig out and the money we have to use to dig out in 3 years on the back of the worst economic contraction that the world has seen in our lifetimes is going to be a lot more challenging. I mean, so I'd like to be able to try to implement some of these political ideas when the pie was larger, not when the pie is smaller. Let's recognize that a lot of people, some of whom are very empowered, are going to be fighting over that. And then there's the broader point, the one that you just raised for me, Chris, which is that the country that right now is actually fastest out of the gate from lockdown is China. And indeed, the reason they're fastest out of the gate is because they have technologically empowered surveillance state that we could not begin to implement in the United States or in Europe, and thank God for that. But we need to understand that that means, in an absence of global leadership, even with the political backlash that we're seeing in the US and other places, that China's ability to get other countries to align with their technological standards, their trade, their conditionality for the supply chain, for the lending that they do, is becoming more powerful over time, not less. In part because their economy is larger and will be larger still because they're flat this year while the Americans and Europeans are contracting, but in part because of the nature of this crisis and what it takes to get through a pandemic. And so when I look at all three of those trend lines together, I mean, obviously no one's really optimistic right now because there's no country that's better off, there's no people that's better off having gone through this pandemic than before. But I wish I could say that I feel like the trend lines are moving more in our direction. I feel like only one of the three are, and it's not necessarily the strongest one.
I'm sorry, what is the one of the three?
Well, the one that all three of us have mentioned now, the fact that we do have a broader piece of the political spectrum that's willing to at least consider, and in some cases have the capacity to begin to implement some of these solutions.
Right. One, when I read your first book, Thomas, I was left with the basic conundrum, I guess, chiefly in the American context of, yes, there is a growing sort of public sentiment behind measures like a wealth tax and greater recognition of the harm that inequality has wrought on our social fabric. At the same time, our political elites, are lagging, let's say. And it's true, yes, that Warren and Sanders made some progress along these lines, and Biden is sort of following up on that. But I'm wondering, since we are, this is the self-interested American question, we're in a polity that for 40 years has been organized around tax cuts as a panacea for any economic distress. And are there measures we can take sort of in the pre-tax economy, things like breaking the sort of monopoly of intellectual property and patent rights that can make the economy less extremely unequal prior to the intervention of the state?
Yeah, but breaking monopolies is certainly part of the solution. I think, you know, the key ingredient historically has been education and, you know, labor law and sharing of power in companies. Education is really the key driver both behind equality and behind prosperity. And, you know, if the US economy was the world economic leader for a long time during the 20th century, it's not because it was the leader of inequality. It's because it was the leader of education and the leader of a relative level of equality in education. You know, in the middle of the 20th century, the US was a country with more than 90% of a generation going to high school at a time where in Western Europe or in Japan, it was between 20 and 30%. So the US was an educational leader, and with at least more equality in educational achievements than other countries and at any other society in the past. And this is what made you know, the US an economic leader. You know, it was not the level of its concentration of wealth or the power of its army, whatever, although, you know, this was also important, but the key thing was being an educational leader. And in the 1980s, you know, there was a sort of change of narrative where somehow Reagan was able to impose a completely different narrative to the country, basically saying, no, what we need, you know, is more concentration of wealth and economic power among a small group of entrepreneurs, and we need to, in a way, we've gone too far in the reduction of inequality, and this is why other countries have been catching up with us, which was wrong. I think if you look at it historically, you know, countries were catching up for all sorts of other reasons, but somehow, you know, there was this very strong and powerful message saying, you know, we've lost, you know, we need to go back to this sort of myth of extreme entrepreneurial 19th century laissez-faire economies. This will bring us more growth. In fact, it did not. You know, growth was reduced by 2. So if you look, you know, national income per capita, you know, the growth rate between 1990 and 2020 in the US has been 1.1%. And it was 2.2% between 1950 and 1990. It was also about 2% between 1910 and 1950, or 1870 and 1910. So the last 30 years, you know, have been the lowest growth in history. There are probably complicated explanations behind this, you know, the gradual exhaustion of energy resources and increase in energy prices can be one of them, in which case it's not necessarily bad to have less growth. But I don't think this is the main, you know, this will be very important in the future. I don't think this was the main explanation for this growth slowdown. I think the main explanation was actually the stagnation of educational investment. And it's very striking if you look at the numbers. Is that the, you know, as a share of GDP or national income, the total resources going toward education have been stagnating as a fraction of GDP national income in the US, but also in Europe over the past 30 years, in spite of the fact that you have a big increase in a fraction of a generation going to university, which means that investment per student has been going down. So I'm not talking, you know, you know, students going to Harvard, you know, have a good investment, there's no problem, but, you know, people who are in the bottom 50 or 60 or 70% of US colleges or universities in other countries don't get the resources they should. And, you know, I think that's the key. So I think we have to go back, you know, to change the narrative again. The problem is that in the special case of the US, the Reaganian narrative is still powerful because, you know, part of the narrative was geopolitical. You know, we are going to bring communism down, and indeed communism, you know, at the end of the Reagan decade disappeared. I don't think this was because of the domestic tax policy of Reagan, but somehow even today, you know, people still have a hard time completely changing, and that's a big question for the Democrats. You know, Joe Biden voted the Tax Reform Act of 1986, lowering down the top income tax rate to 28%, and he never really explain to which extent he has changed his mind since then. And you know, I think today could be the time, you know, to get a different, a different direction. You know, the Democratic Party in the US has been losing middle class and lower middle class voters for many decades now. I think largely because they were not very ambitious in their social platform and redistributive platform. And you know, as you were saying, you know, this crisis can be, you know, can be the time to have a different kind of discourse, and you know, let's see.
Indeed, yeah, and I think we tend to forget, you know, the very, you know, platform we're having this conversation on, the internet, was something created by social investment in R&D and education on a massive scale. We would not be doing this without that, you know, direction of capital. And yeah, I wanted to pick up on something you had said earlier, how globalization has compounded the inequality crisis in our time. And I think we're also seeing right now, the pandemic is in many ways a reflection of the failures of globalization. You're seeing obviously the global supply chain being a delivery system for coronavirus in many ways, and you're seeing, you know, lagging and failed efforts in the Eurozone to contain the spread. And I wanted to, again, ask Gillian, since the Financial Times is a, you know, voice of
finance. Yeah.
Yes, how, you know, we unwind that piece of the globalization piece of the present crisis. What are the incentives, as it were, that we can create to envision a different kind of economy that is, you know, more susceptible to local regulation and local control?
Well, I think it's really important when people talk about globalization to realize that there are four components of it, which often get mashed together. On the one hand, you have the movement of trade and services, and that's the element people tend to focus on. Then you have the movement of money, then you have the movement of people, and then you have the movement of information ideas, which these days is primarily through the internet. And if you look at those, I mean, there was an explosion in the movement of trade, did goods and services in the last couple of decades of the 20th century and the early part of this century, very much around the global supply chain idea going into hyperdrive all over the world. And what's interesting is that even before that, even before the 2008 crisis, there were signs that was starting to slow down. And I do think we're now seeing a major reassessment of that. And one consequence of this crisis is going to be a lot of onshoring, a lot of localization in people's focus. And that's going to be playing out over a number of years in all kinds of ways. And I think investors have barely got their heads around that yet. Mm-hmm. To me, the other interesting issues, though, are to what degree do you see the globalization of money, the movement of money across borders, be slowed down as well? My suspicion is that it will be, because I suspect we're going towards an era of what people like Carmen Reinhart call financial repression, which means trying to pay off debt by keeping interest rates below the level of inflation and potentially introducing more capital controls as well. The people movement is definitely going to be slowing down. We're seeing that already. The other interesting question is the information movement. Are we going to see the globalization of information and the internet start to face a lot more controls going forward, or to be essentially splitting into different parts? We've seen elements of that already in places like China, but you know, that to me is a lot of areas to play for. But certainly the localization of production of supply chains, coupled with growing digital technologies, which means that companies can do that more cheaply than they could before, is absolutely going to be a key theme going forward. And that's being discussed. I say the issue about capital controls and potential information controls is probably less discussed. Ian, though, knows a lot about those themes. So maybe I should throw to Ian.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ian, if we're unwinding globalization, you might be out of a job, right?
Well, I mean, you know, my last book was about the failure of globalism. And to be clear, I think there's a big difference between globalism and globalization. I see globalization as a massive win, but globalism is the political ideology that believes that you should promote that, but don't have to necessarily take care of the losers from the process. And that's obviously not okay. Look, I mean, globalization did not drive global inequality. Globalization gave us a global middle class. I mean, we brought, you know, 1 billion people out of poverty that otherwise weren't. And so if you want to look at the entire distribution of human wealth, let's for a second pretend that we're not from the United States or France or the UK. I and that actually we think all human beings are equally relevant for the conversation. Again, I know we don't act that way, but we can presume that we do for the conversation. And you look over the course of the last 50 years, and you have a narrow sliver at the 1%, 0.1% that's done fantastically well. But otherwise, you've gotten this incredible rise in a global middle class. And that should be welcomed. There's no question. And unfortunately, that happened while the wealthy countries were ignoring their own quote unquote middle classes, who are people that are actually very wealthy in the context of the global scheme of things, but they were allowing them to wither, allowing their social contracts to not work. And we look in the United States at the suicide rates, the life expectancy of the average person who's not in the top 10%. In the US, the world's most powerful economy, has gone down in the last few decades. Like, that's not remotely acceptable for these people. And telling them that China now has a middle class makes them vote for Trump. Right. I mean, obviously, and that's what happen. Now, what's interesting, and I think what moves in Thomas' favor and direction, is that actually even the global middle class is now, I think, going to find itself much more threatened, because the only winners that come out of coronavirus are the tech companies. I mean, as a sector, right? I mean, those are the big winners. Right now, we can still have this conversation even though you can't go to a movie theater. Why? Because of the tech companies. This is why the economy still works, and it's also how we're going to get out of this crisis with the geo-tracing and everything else that will be required. Now, as that happens, every CEO out there is going to find ways to ensure that they can be more effective, more efficient with less labor. And so as capitalism becomes increasingly decoupled from labor, all of those people in China and India, that just-in-time supply chain that was so incredibly efficient with their low labor rates, well, that labor's gotten more expensive, and those people are more problematic for the way that the economy is going to be running in 5-10 years' time. Heck, maybe in 18 months' time. And so I think the number of people around the world that are going to find the Piketty manifesto, if you will, much more compelling in the next decade is going to be far beyond what you've seen in the United States and within the European Union in the last decade. I think that's a very important shift as we globalize this conversation. Because look, when you final point for me, when you think about something like a pandemic, or you think about something like a climate crisis, these are global crises. They require a globalized response, not an American response, not a European response. It's not just about your social safety net. And the reason we're failing right now to deal with the pandemic is precisely because we can't do a global medical supply chain. We're blaming each other. We can't, and when the virus vaccine actually comes, and it's probably made by the United States, but for 6 months, 12 months, it's not available to other countries around the world, we're going to see just how deep that rabbit hole goes. Climate change is much more obvious and much more existential in that regard. So again, I think this is exactly the time to be really sort of chewing over these incredibly challenging and difficult issues.
Gillian, you were raising your hand?
I had a point to make, which is sorry.
Yeah, and also your volume is screwed up. Thomas, you want to reply?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jan, for the good news that my
yes, I know you're going to conquer the global marketplace.
Yeah, well, by the way, it's important. Sometimes people in the US overestimate, the importance of the US market, including in terms of market for ideas. So my previous book, Capital in the 21st Century, 80% of the sales were actually outside of the English language. So not only outside of the US, but outside of the English language. And there were actually more sales in China in Mandarin than in English. So I think the issue of inequality has been a global issue, is a global issue. And I agree with you, it's probably more and more going to be a global issue in the sense that the emerging global middle class and lower middle class, who had very fast growth, in particular in China, over the past 20, 30 years, the future is going to look different. And at some point, the issue of inequality is going to become even more important. But it is already important. So let me stress that the rise of inequality and the big change in ideology in the past 30 years was not only in the West, it was also, and to some extent, even more strongly, in China, in Russia, in India, and so you've had an increase in concentration of wealth at the very top with the Russian oligarchs, but to some extent also with the Chinese oligarchs, which was certainly not necessary to reduce poverty, and it would have been possible to have even more growth and faster decline in poverty without this huge concentration of wealth. And what we've shown in the World Inequality Report is that the top 1% at the global level got the total share of world growth between 1980 and 2018 that they appropriated, in effect, was twice as large as what the bottom 50% of the world appropriated. So it's true, you have people in the middle, between the bottom 50% and top 1% who were the first losers, and in particular the many people in the north. But this rising inequality, because it was also in the south, in the end took a huge proportion of world growth, which it's very difficult to say that it was this was absolutely necessary in order to get emerging countries to grow. Maybe some increase of inequality as compared to the level in China in 1980 was necessary, but it didn't have to go so far as what it did. And there is more concern in China today than we sometimes pretend there is, and this is really something we need to follow very closely in the future. That being said, it is true that the Western model, and in particular, the US model, but for some other reasons, the European model is considerably weakened, and this is why, despite all its limitation and all its opacity, the Chinese model should be taken seriously, as Jan noticed, and we are going to have this big world competition of economic system and ideological system, and which is going to continue, and certainly this pandemic is going to be instrumentalized in this way very strongly. And just last point, final point, it's really too early to say, how this pandemic is going to turn out. What's going to happen in the South? What's going to happen in India, in Africa? Are we going to stay in the situation where we are today, where the spread of the pandemic seems limited, or is it going to turn differently? That could change completely the narrative and the reading of the crisis, and governments. Remember in India last year, there was a very interesting electoral campaign where there was actually a proposal to introduce a basic income. Right. And 6 months before the election, it was not clear who was going to win. Then there was the terror attack in Kashmir in January 2019, and this completely changed the election. And Modi was very skilled at making it an identity-based election, Hindu against Muslim. But it was not. It could have been different, And then, maybe we would have a basic income in India today, and maybe Modi. Although this is not his ideology and his priority, if the crisis gets really bad in India, they've just increased the confinement for 2 more weeks. Right. We'll end up to have to develop a safety net and a basic social transfer system in a way nobody would have imagined beforehand. This is what we see in history all the time. Governments, do things that they did not really plan to do before the new context happens, and so. We'll see.
Yes. And I also wanted to follow up. This is a concept you explore in your new book more, and you've mentioned it a few times in this conversation, the idea of the desacralization of property, which I've also written. My last book was about the sacralization of property in the United States in many ways. And I'm curious what evidence you're seeing of, this comes out of your critique of the French Revolution, not essentially going far enough in remaking property relations. I think we are living in a world, as both Ian and Gillian have noted, of increasingly socialized capital, and a world where, to meet the present emergency, that has to develop further. And I think we have, we do have to rewire our brains in certain ways to think of, you know, it's a cliche in a situation like this, but we're all in this together. And the movie says at one point that death is a great equalizing force. We are all equal in the face of death. And that is something I think, even though, you know, we in this conversation are in a comparatively privileged situation, we feel that very acutely right now, as anyone does. So I'm wondering, you know, this is sort of an ambitious ask of you, Thomas, but how does property look going forward? And related to that, you mentioned education, and the rise of a mass middle class. That's based on a conception of property, of a notion of proprietorship, as we call it in American history. So what kind of property works in this radically reconfigured world order? And how do we make it better?
Yeah, so, you know, if we take a long-run perspective on this, you know, the French Revolution and also the US Revolution, you know, transform a society based on religion, based on monarchy, on a society based on a religion of property to a large extent. So in the 19th century, you know, the full respect of property rights, you know, including, you know, property rights over slaves, you know, was viewed as sort of the very basis of society. And even if you want to abolish slavery, you need to compensate financially slave owners, because, you know, otherwise, if you neglect property rights, you know, complete chaos is going to follow. Now, starting at the end of the 19th century, because of labor movement, socialist movement in particular, and after World War I, after World War II, there was a huge acceleration in this direction, but it's a long-run movement. You know, there's been a long-run movement since the end of the 19th century towards some form of desacralization of property, in the sense that today, you know, in spite of the rise in inequality since the 80s, in spite of the fall of communism and all the sort of the new, sometimes unlimited faith in private property and self-regulated markets that we've seen since 1990, we still live in a world where, you know, property rights have been counterbalanced by the rights of workers, the rights of consumers, the right of collective government, in a way which makes our property relation today much more balanced and very different than 100 years ago. You know, 100 years ago, you could just, you know, double the rent of a tenant and throw the tenant away. You can throw the worker away. I mean, today, sometimes you can do that in some countries, in some contexts, but by and large, it doesn't work exactly the same. And, you know, there are countries, including very rich countries like Germany and Sweden, where workers' representatives have up to half of voting rights in the board of large corporation. And, you know, apparently this seems to work. And, you know, shareholders in my country, in France, don't like that. They don't want to see that. They want to see workers in the streets demonstrating. They don't want to show them their books and have them in their boards. But, you know, at some point, I think they will have to, because I think, you know, this movement will continue. You know, I think there's some discussion, not only in France, but also in the US, in Britain, about getting more workers' rights in corporate boards, which, you know, I will bet that in 10 years or 20 years, you know, things will go in this direction. You know, it depends. It will take political fight, but I think there's a long run movement in this direction. Now, this particular crisis, well, you know, we have this discussion right now about rent freeze and, you know, a requisition of housing in order to put infected people or homeless people, and, you know, should we have a rent freeze? And, you know, I think this is a very serious issue, because if people can't go and work and can't pay their rent, you know, what are you going to do? Are you going to put them in the street? You know, is this the way to fight a pandemic? You know, it makes me think a little bit. Well, yeah, it's a different crisis, but in the case of Britain, ideology of property in the 19th century, the crisis in Ireland, you know, following the famine in Ireland, where, you know, British landowners wanted their rent paid during the famine by, you know, people who were dying, basically. And in the end, you know, this contributed to the anger and to the change in ideology in the following decade. Well, this you know, in the specific case of Ireland, it became independent 70 years later. But more generally, you know, the extreme ideology of sacralization of property in the end was weakened by its own selfishness that was displayed during this episode. And you know, I don't know what will happen with this particular pandemic, but, you know, I think we should take seriously the fact that we have to question, you know, the standard right of property relation and paying rent, and, you know, in those very special circumstances we are today. Actually, both for households and for businesses, you know, which you know, small businesses that could be kicked away of their premises. So we'll see, but potentially this can lead to a re-questioning of some of this property relation.
And that's, we are actually out of time for the formal discussion, but I quickly wanted to canvass both you, Gillian, and you, Ian, to get your general, you know, Tom, a little to my surprise, Thomas is sounding very optimistic, and I wonder if you, each of you, from your own vantage points, share that optimism. We'll start with you, Gillian.
Well, I'll say that what this crisis is doing is forcing a zeitgeist shift. In a sense, we're going through those 5 stages of grief, where you start off with shock, denial, anger, and we're starting to get towards more of a sense of acceptance and a proper debate. And to my mind, you know, there are 3 different axes which are going to be part of that debate going forward: the market economy versus the non-market economy, localization versus globalization, and then green versus, if you like, you know, growth at all costs. Right. And I think it's going to be a very interesting issue going forward, because I don't think we can just go back to entirely business as usual before. What this crisis has shown us is that we are all linked in a chain of humanity, and we're only as strong, to be honest, as the weakest link in the chain when it comes to something like a pandemic. And the people who we ignore, who are marginalized or inconvenient or simply not visible to us, suddenly are starting to matter. And science is suddenly starting to matter, which it wasn't before. And that could play into climate change as well, because we've also seen that actually people can change their behavior in some surprising ways. It may not be sustainable, but who would have imagined that in New York, where I'm standing now, everybody would have been wearing masks a little while ago? Who would imagine that by and large, the lockdown has been observed? So there's a lot that's fluid right now, a lot in motion, and it's going to be fantastically interesting to see how it plays out in the next year. For someone who's a journalist, an economist, a pundit, it is an extraordinary moment to be trying to make sense of the world. Although for many of us, it is also a terrible, tragic moment and terribly difficult time to be, you know, living and working.
So I'm a political scientist, and it is through that lens not really plausible to be very optimistic about this moment for some obvious reasons. This is the worst crisis of our lifetimes, with the most incapable US president in modern history in an election cycle. That's really sad, right? That's really unfortunate. It's the worst crisis of our lifetimes when Europe is in much greater disagreement, fragmentation, disarray internally within individual countries, and also existentially in terms of the sustainability of growth of the Eurozone. The Russians are in decline. They're doing everything possible to undermine us and continue to delegitimize democratic institutions because they blame us for it, only partially plausibly. And the Chinese are not aligning increasingly with our values and institutions as we thought they might over the past decades. They're not becoming responsible stakeholders. They're actually building competitive models. So the fact that this crisis is happening at that geopolitical point, as opposed to, say, in the 60s or in 1995, or in 2005, it really makes you much less optimistic. The thing that I'm optimistic about is actually not in my field, but it is relevant. And that is that if you had to take 10% out of the global economy, which I think is basically what you're doing, right? We're just going to shrink the pie we had, and we're saying at the end of the year, end of 18 months, sorry, it's 90% of what was 100%. Go from there. At least the people that are most empowered, the companies that are most empowered, are those that are most oriented towards the 21st century, as opposed to those most oriented towards the 20th century. I mean, imagine if this crisis, same size of crisis, imagine if it had been a Russian cyber attack that brought down a digital economy and made you question your virtual identity and its sanctity. and made virtual banking problematic. And so the companies that did the best were actually the ones that were in the real and not the digital, the brick and mortar, were the ones that were most oriented towards the 20th century. You just wouldn't get the productivity, the efficiency, the investment gains that you really need to be able to respond to the coming crises, like climate change. Like, I feel better that we're gonna have AI solutions that might help because of the nature of this crisis in dealing with climate, for example, or food efficiency, or any of these other things. So, I mean, maybe it's not the best silver lining, and I'm an existential optimist anyway, because the mystery of creation is wonderful for all of us. But the geopolitics, you just cannot be happy about the geopolitics right now. This is a geopolitical recession. It's a really bad time to have one.
Agreed. Thanks for bringing us back down to earth, Ian.
Let me simply say, to end up on a more optimistic note. That
okay.
Dare you, Thomas?
We've never been so optimistic for quite a long time about US leadership. So, you know, Trump is a pretty bad president, but, you know, George W. Bush invading Iraq was not such a great president. And so, you know, in other parts of the world, you know, we've learned that, you know, solutions do not necessarily come from the US.
Yes,
but,
yes.
you know, apart from that, I agree with you that, you know, we should be cautiously optimistic, and most of all, we should believe in mobilization of citizens. You know, I think economic, financial issues do not belong to a small group of experts, and this is the message of this movie and of this book, and what we are all trying to contribute to. You know, more citizen mobilization and involvement in this issue can make a difference.
Well, on that note of citizen mobilization, I'd like to turn to a few questions from our virtual audience. One is from Gillian McCommons, who notes that, first of all, it would have been good, which I agree, to have other than white participants in this discussion. And noting, in addition, that race is intertwined in, obviously, the modern history of colonialism and the expansion of global capital. How do we interpret the abuse of race as we're seeing now in the rise of global populism and Trumpism as a response, and how do we draw attention to the way it's used to divide the citizenry in opposition to capital?
Yeah, it's used more and more. It's been used, of course, in the US for a very long time. You know, racial division and that's probably one of the explanations for the limited development of a welfare state in the US. Right. It's been used more and more in European politics in the past 30 years. It's been used recently a lot in India. Yes. You know, I think this is largely due to the fact that, you know, because we've closed down the economic debate for so long, you know, people find for solution elsewhere. So, you know, if you tell people for many decades that, you know, there's no other economic system, there's no other economic policies, that governments cannot do anything about market regulation, about taxation, about redistribution, and the only thing they can do is to do border control and to control the frontier of their nations. And then, you know, you should not be surprised that the political discussion is going to be more and more about borders control and about identity. And I think, you know, we still live, if we take a longer run perspective, we are very much still in a sort of post-communist, post-colonial world. So post-communism led to a lot of disillusion about the idea of changing the economic system for obvious reasons. And you know, the problem is that this has gone too far in the other direction, but you know, you can see why this could have contributed to some form of economic disillusion about the very notion of economic justice and changing capitalism. And at the same time, post-colonialism has brought more diversity in our societies through, you know, migration starting in the 60s, 70s, 80s after decolonization. So now we live in more diverse society in Europe, but not only that ever before. And so the combination of economic disillusion and increased diversity has opened the door for all sorts of basically, you know, racialist or identity-based ideologies that have, you know, feed, you know, the vacuum ideology that there was. But I think this is beginning to change. You know, I think starting, you know, since the 2008 financial crisis, there's been a sort of gradual awakening of, you know, economic thinking or changing the economic system. The challenge of global warming, of course, is putting, you know, strong pressure to change the economic system. And I think, you know, we've not talked a lot about that today, but I think one of the impact of the pandemic is that, you know, 6 months ago, when people were saying, okay, we should calm down airplane transportation, international trade, everybody was saying, okay, this is impossible, this would be too costly. And then suddenly we are able to do it very fast. And I think many people, you know, will ask for, you know, a different kind of recovery than what we had. They will also ask for a different kind of monetary policy. You know, the fact that we've had all this money creation to save the banks in the past 10 years, now everybody has understood that, you know, even people who are not economists or financial experts has understood that this was really a lot of money creation, and there's going to be increasing demand, you know, to put similar resources to fight the pandemics, but also to invest in green technology. You can see that. So maybe not in the US, but, you know, in Europe, this is getting really strong. So that's, you know, this is I think.
And again, to put in a plug for the June issue of the New Republic, Dean Baker has a very good, ambitious essay arguing for measures to do exactly that, to make, to sort of reduce the financialization of the economy and also to make it greener, more equitable. And all of this is a segue to the next audience question, which is, please comment from Howard Manas, please comment on the comprehensive social and economic reforms proposed in the Green New Deal. And I think I'll turn to you, Gillian, since this is one of your areas of concentration. How does as Thomas said, we didn't touch as directly as we might have on the climate crisis in this discussion, and how do we pivot from this crisis to that one?
Well, there's two schools of thought about this current crisis and how it's going to impact the green debate. One school says that it's going to be so distracting that everyone's going to be focused on a dash for growth at all costs, and that basically the green agenda is going to be pushed aside. The other argument is that you've had an episode which demonstrates, one, science really matters, whatever the politics. Two, we are interlinked as a human chain, and you can't just ignore things on the other side of the world and pretend to go away. Three, that actually people can change in their attitudes and sometimes change quite fast, which is very important. And the youth vote matters in that respect too. And four, that there are times when the state can work very closely with companies, if not take control of companies, or actually move towards more greater control of the economy to basically chase ends. So things like the use of the DPA in the US, which have been unimaginable in the medical field until very recently, show how attitudes are changing. So one of the questions is that going to be replicated, that set of features, looking at the green debate going forward? Honest answer, we just don't know at the moment. But it's going to be extremely interesting to watch, because aside from the focus on the Green New Deal and the ideas emanating from the left, one thing that's changed in the last 6 months, which is really fascinating, is increased awareness on the right as well about climate issues. And they don't use the words climate change, that's taboo. Instead, they talk about things like environmental protection, sustainability. There's a whole bunch of tag stewardship is the other big one that appeals to the Christian right. But there's a growing drive, even inside the heart of the Republican Party now, to look at using what they would argue is more market-based mechanisms, such as a carbon tax or what they call a carbon dividend, to try to get some more aspect of green into the economy and economic direction. I think the carbon dividend idea is something that's going to quite likely gather traction in the next couple of years. With oil prices as low as they are, it's much easier to pick up on that idea right now. So there's a lot, again, to play for. But I'm not in the camp that says actually this has totally distracted everyone from the green agenda permanently.
Yeah, no, I think, as you say, it is a science-based question, and we have seen people alter their behavior dramatically in a way we couldn't have anticipated. Ian, what's your view on the prospects for Green New Deal as the House pessimist.
Well, I'm actually more optimistic about climate in the sense that I think that first, an enormous amount of money is already being put towards making post-fossil fuel energy sustainable and efficient.
Right.
I mean, you know, solar's cheaper than coal right
And
now.
the oil market has collapsed.
Who
So.
would have thought that 10 years ago? So, I mean, I think the momentum is already there. And I think the attitudes of young people around the world, even in the United States, across the political spectrum, that's new, but it's exciting. Now, of course, I mean, you know, Greta is under lockdown and we're not talking about her very much anymore. At the beginning of the year was the year of Greta and we were all going to be talking about climate change. So I understand that you're losing some momentum. The thing that probably bothers me is that, you know, many, even of the most progressive voices in the United States talk about this exclusively in terms of what needs to be done in the United States. When, I mean, of course,
20%.
It's not a Green New Deal, it's a Green Marshall Plan.
Right.
I mean, the issue
Right.
is that the United States and the rich countries have done all the emitting for a long time and now we're telling, you know, the Chinese and the Indians, okay, guys, you're going to have to really tighten your belt.
Right.
No, I mean, we're
Right.
going to have to pay them to do that. We're going to have to distribute.
Right.
There has to be
Incentives,
global equity. And, you know, I think that we have to understand that even the most progressive forces in the West tend to become really nationalist and really isolationist when you start talking about resource allocation that matters for people that don't happen to be American or don't happen to be European.
Yeah.
Microsoft, for example, came out recently, said that by 2050, they're going to be carbon neutral, not just for 2050, not for that year, but for the entire history of Microsoft. Now, if we were to start talking about things that way in the United States and in the advanced industrial economies, you might actually have more of a starting point to talk to the developing world.
Right. Well, I think we're actually out of time. This has been a tremendously interesting and provocative and stimulating discussion. I really want to thank all our panelists and Kino and Lorber for making all this happen. And thank you out there for joining in. Have a great Sunday, everyone. And I guess I'll...
Stay safe.
Yes, you too, as we all now say.